A little over a year ago, I did a video on the complete history of Rohan. It was 2 hours and 9 minutes long, by far the longest video I had ever done. While I certainly did enjoy making the video and started working on an epic about the Arthedain shortly afterwards, the nature of this channel is that I soon got distracted, started working on other ideas, and the longer format video fell into the shuffle. But on my recent post about reaching 40,000 subscribers, the highest voted comment asked me to do another longer format video, and several other well-liked comments asked me to do a video on Arthedain. While that Arthedain video will one day come on its own, I decided, why not combine the concepts? Let's do that epic podcast-like video on the history of one of my favourite topics, and one of your favourite topics too, the lost Northern Kingdom of Arnor. And if you haven't seen my Rohan podcast video, I would like to make a disclaimer. This is the type of video that you can treat as a podcast. There will be visuals, but it's not necessary to watch the video. You can instead listen to it, perhaps while you work, or work out, or play games, or while you're cooking, or while you're commuting, or while you're digging suspicious holes in your backyard that are definitely not body-shaped. Anyway, here we go. I hope you enjoy the ride. Out of the great sea to Middle-earth I am come. In this place will I abide, and my heirs, unto the ending of the world. These are the words that Elendil the Tall said when he stepped foot on Middle-earth, after the downfall of Numenor in the year 3319 of the Second Age. The following year, he would found Arnor, the northern kingdom of the Dunedain. In that place, his heirs would abide. But the history of Arnor was not sunshine and rainbows. It's a tale of gradual decline, of brother fighting brother, of invasions that would see an entire region of Middle-earth reduced to ruin. Of course, every tale should have a beginning, and there are common questions about the beginning, such as, didn't Elendil and his sons arrive in Middle-earth with only 9 ships? Then how did they found 2 powerful kingdoms? Well, that's the thing. While Arnor's history officially began in 3320, the foundations of the kingdom had been laid for thousands of years, so that when Elendil did arrive, he did not create everything from scratch. He took over the leadership of a land that no longer had a leader, founded cities where there were merely colonies, creating a kingdom that would last for the next 2,000 years. So as I just said, the foundations were laid long before Elendil. At the beginning of the Second Age, the land that would become Arnor, known mostly as Eriador, was a land that was home to many peoples, elves in the west, dwarves in the mountains, but between the River Brandywine and the Misty Mountains, Eriador was home to men. In the south, there were the Gwytherim, the Shadow People. In the centre, there was the men of Eriador, and in the east and north, mysterious peoples in the Troll Shores and in Angmar. But in 600 of the Second Age, the Numenoreans returned to Middle-earth. This was done by the captain of the king's ships, Fiancha, and he would have a historic meeting with the men of Eriador in the Tower Hills. As both groups of men were descended from the ancestors of the Baorians and the Hadorians, 2 of the 3 houses of the Arthedain, they realised that they had languages that were mutually intelligible, and things started off well. But it was Fiancha's protege, Aldarion, the Crown Prince of Numenor, who would really kick off Numenorean investment in Middle-earth. This started with long and frequent voyages, and culminated in the foundation of Numenor's first permanent port in Middle-earth, Vignalonde, later known as Londare Ned, at the mouth of the River Gwythlo. This port was especially important for Aldarion. His father, Tarmanelder, would soon place a ban on the amount of lumber that could be used for ships on Numenor. The vast forests of Enedwaith and Minhiriath would provide Numenor's ever-increasing amount of wood required for ships. This did not come without consequence. The forests of Enedwaith and Minhiriath were home to the aforementioned Gwytherim, and they did not take kindly to the gradual destruction of their homeland. The Numenoreans paid little heed to the Gwytherim, believing them to be men of shadow. This was later found to be untrue by Gondorian historians, as the Gwytherim were actually related to the Hallimar, who spoke an entirely different language to the rest of the Arthedain. Thus, the feud escalated, and it came to violence when the Gwytherim started ambushing Numenorean camps and burning their stores of lumber. In response, the Numenoreans began to fortify their positions along the River Gwythlo. In the years of Tar Aldarion's reign, and the years following, the Numenoreans began making more havens in Middle-earth, now further to the south, near to the River Anduin. However, full-scale colonization did not come until the 18th century, and that was thanks to a major event, the War of the Elves and Sauron. In that war, Eriador was ravaged, the elves and men of Eriador were severely weakened, the Gwytherim were forced to flee their homelands, and in the end, it was the might of Numenor that crushed Sauron in consecutive battles, the most decisive being the Battle of the Gwythlo. It's important not to understate what this war did to the mindset of the Numenoreans. They had taken on the greatest power in Middle-earth and won comfortably. They had had a taste of their own strength, and what's more, the westlands of Middle-earth had been ravaged, the forces of Sauron destroyed. Now was the perfect time to begin exerting further influence upon the continent. This picked up during the reign of Tar-Minestir, and was continued by his successors. But Tar-Minestir was considered one of the last good kings of Numenor. His successors, Tar-Kiryatan, and then Tar-Atanamir and Tar-Ankalimon, were responsible for the beginning of Numenor's slide into the shadow. Before them, the Numenoreans had come to Middle-earth as teachers and gift-givers. Now they came as subjugators and exploiters. The men of Middle-earth came to fear the Numenoreans, who took their lands along the coast and built great fortresses of their own. This change was felt in Numenor itself. Starting in the reign of Tar-Atanamir, the Numenoreans started to split into two separate factions. The larger group was the King's Men. They followed the ways of the king, were distrustful of elves, spoke against the ban of the Valar, and dominated the men of Middle-earth. The smaller group were the Faithful. They remained loyal to the Valar, remained friends of the elves, and although their relations with the men of Middle-earth were not perfect, they at least strived to treat them better. And perhaps this is where we can say that Arnor started to take shape. As a result of their feud with the King's Men, the Faithful preferred to settle in the north of Middle-earth, their most southerly settlement being the port of Pelagir on the river Anduin. While their colonization of Eriador is not described in great detail, we know that Numenoreans settled in places such as Lake Evendim, the North Downs, the Barrow Downs, and even some as far east as the hills of the Trollshores. That said, during this time, the native men of Eriador, those who survived the War of the Elves and Sauron, also began to recover, and they always outnumbered the Numenoreans and their Dunedain descendants. Migration of the Faithful to Middle-earth increased during the reign of Argamilzor, who hated the Faithful and openly persecuted them. During this time, most of the Faithful in Numenor lived in the west in Anduniae, but Argamilzor forcibly migrated them to the east of Numenor, suspecting them of secretly harbouring elves. It was during the reign of Argamilzor where perhaps one of the greatest heroes in the history of Middle-earth was born, Elendil. Born in 3119, Elendil was the son of Amandil, the 18th and last Lord of Anduniae. He wasn't just a figurative giant, he was a literal giant too, with some sources putting him as tall as 241 centimeters or almost 8 feet, hence the name the Tall. We actually don't know much about him, except that he was wise, loyal, and brave, a true paragon of virtue. His two sons, Isildur and Anarion, were also heroes in their own right. While the Faithful received some reprieve during the reign of the repentant Tar-Palantir, things soon became much, much worse. In 3255, Ar-Pharazôn usurped the throne. At first, this was perhaps not the worst thing, as Amandil and Ar-Pharazôn were friends in their youth, despite their differing views, and Amandil even had a seat on Ar-Pharazôn's council. But in 3262, Ar-Pharazôn captured Sauron and brought him back to Numenor. Within just a few years, Sauron had corrupted the king and many other Numenoreans too, and Amandil was ejected from the council. In the years that followed, Numenor somehow got even worse, taking part in abominable practices such as slavery and human sacrifice. The Faithful were far too often the victims of the latter. In the end, Ar-Pharazôn's final fall came due to the weight of his own mortality. The fear of death consumed him, and Sauron offered him a solution: attack Valinor and seize the Undying Land for himself. In 3310, he began the construction of the Great Armament, a massive fleet and invasion force that would be able to conquer all of Aman. In 3316, realizing the gravity of the situation, Amandil decided to sail into the west to preemptively beg the Valar for forgiveness. His fate, or whether he had any success in his mission, is unknown. But what we do know are his final instructions to Elendil. he tells them to gather the remaining faithful and for them to put themselves aboard ships off the east coast of Numenor alongside all of their belongings. These instructions, perhaps brought on by the gift of foresight, turn out to be immensely important for the future of Middle-earth. Sure enough, in 3319, Ar-Pharazôn sets sail, lands in the Marne, and brings down divine wrath upon himself and the Numenoreans. The world is made round, Valinor is removed from the circles of the world, and Numenor is sent crashing to the bottom of the sea, millions of souls perishing in mere moments. Aboard their 9 ships, the faithful are saved by what might have been a divine wind, but they are blown off course and away from each other. In the end, Elendil lands in Lindon with 4 ships, and Isildur with 3, and Anarion with 2, land near to Pelargir in the land that would shortly become Gondor. Numenor is gone, there is no going back, and all the Numenoreans have left now is Middle-earth. As a leader of the faithful, and as a descendant of Eärendil, it is now Elendil's destiny to continue Numenor on Middle-earth, and thus we have the founding of the realms in exile. And that brings us back to where we started, where Elendil has stepped ashore and declared that this is where he and his heirs shall remain. So, what happened next? As I've hopefully made clear, Eriador was already home to plenty of Numenoreans and other Middle-men, but this was not a kingdom, rather a dominion of Numenor on Middle-earth, so while many of the necessary ingredients are there to form a kingdom it is not. So, Elendil starts a kingdom. He founds a Numenas, the Tower of the West, his new capital, at the shores of Lake Evendim. But there are other places he founds too. In the southern hills of the North Downs, he builds another major city, Fornost-Arain, the Northern Fortress. Further to the south, near to the swamps of the Swanfleet, he drains the marshes and builds a bridge across the Gwathlo and founds the town of Tharbad. While doubtless other places were constructed, these are the 3 known most important settlements in Arnor at this time. I spoke of Londare briefly earlier, and while this was an important harbour in the Second Age, it had either already fallen into ruin at this point, or it was going to rather soon. Its importance is eclipsed by Tharbad. Speaking of Arnor, let's talk borders. In the west, it reaches the River Lune in the north, and the Blue Mountains in the south. Beyond that, it is Dwarven and Elven country. In the north, it reaches the Ice Bay of Thorkel, and the soon-to-be infamous wild land of Angmar. In the east, its borders are the Etten Moors, the River Bruinen, and the Misty Mountains, and in the south, it reaches the Great Sea and the River Gwathlo. Notably, beyond the Gwathlo is Gondorian territory, so the 2 countries border each other, and the town of Tharbad was actually jointly garrisoned by both Arnor and Gondor. But while Arnor is quite large, a lot of this territory is hilly, rugged, and rather sparsely populated. If you look at a map, you could probably place Arnor's heartland in a square between 4 different groups of hills: the South Downs, the North Downs, the Hills of Evendim, and the Tower Hills. At the very least, this square was where the majority of the Numenoreans lived, and beyond that were mostly lands that were populated by middlemen, still subjects of the Numenoreans, but in some places, their loyalty could be called into question. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. As you should know, Arnor was founded alongside Gondor, and at this time, the kingdoms were basically one. Arnor was the senior kingdom, despite being weaker than Gondor, and Elendil ruled with the title of High King. He was, therefore, also King of Gondor. But owing to the large distances, it was impossible for him to govern both lands at once, so Isildur and Anarion, each founding their own cities in Gondor, were junior kings, and they ruled side by side on thrones in Osgiliath. Elendil also brought some important heirlooms with him from the ruin of Numenor. There was the Scepter of Numenas. This was originally the Scepter of the Lords of Andunier, but considering the fact that Andunier no longer existed, it was repurposed to be a sign of office for the kings of Arnor. Alongside the Scepter of Numenas was the Ring of Barahir, which had also been passed down through the Lords of Andunier. Elendil also carried Narsil, an ancient sword from the First Age, which would soon become an important heirloom in its own right. There was also a seedling of the White Tree of Numenor, Nimloth, but as Isildur was the one who painstakingly rescued this seedling, this was planted in Minas Ithil in Gondor, not in Arnor. But arguably the most important heirlooms that were brought out of the ruin of Numenor were the Palantiri, the 7 Seeing Stones, likely constructed by Feanor himself. These would allow for easier communication between Gondor and Arnor. They were spread out accordingly. 4 were sent to Gondor, 1 in Minas Anor, 1 in Minas Tirith, 1 in Angrenost, Isengard, and the Master Stone in Osgiliath. 3 were in Arnor, the Illuminas Stone, the Amonsul Stone, the largest of the Arnorian stones, located in the Watchtower of Amonsul, or Weathertop, and the Elostirion Stone, which was kept in the Tower Hills. The Elostirion Stone was unique. It could not be used to communicate with the other stones in Middle-earth, and instead only looked west, and Elendil used it on many occasions. So there we have it, Arnor, the Northern Kingdom. Under the rule of Elendil, it looks like everything is looking up, that nothing could possibly go wrong. But rather sadly, the relatively short rule of Elendil, the 121 years between the downfall of Numenor and the beginning of the Third Age, was Arnor's golden age, because Arnor was about to suffer enormously from a war that was over 1,000 miles from its borders, and any succession plans that Elendil had in mind were about to go out the window. Because unlike all the mortal men on Numenor, Sauron was not destroyed. Thanks to the One Ring, his spirit endured, and he bore it back to Mordor. Quietly, he rebuilt his strength, looking upon the realms in exile and the Dunedain with nothing but hatred and malice. There would be no attempts at diplomacy, no attempts at deception. In 3429 of the Second Age, he suddenly invaded Gondor and overran the city of Minas Ithil. Isildur was forced to flee, and he sailed north to his father. Meanwhile, Anarion held the line at Osgiliath, and showing the might of Gondor, even managed to push Sauron back to the mountains. But it was clear that Sauron was a threat that could not be ignored. In 3430, Elendil called upon his friend, High King Gil-galad of the Noldor, who ruled from his kingdom in Lindon. Elendil swore upon the name of Eru-Ilúvatar and bound them to an oath, the last alliance that would hopefully topple Sauron for good. The armies of elves and men met at the watchtower of Amonsul at the Weather Hills in 3431, and then marched on Rivendell, where they would remain for 3 more years, possibly gathering the supplies for such a huge campaign. Finally, in 3434, they crossed the mountains, where they were joined by the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, the elves of Lothlorien led by King Amdir, and the elves of Mirkwood led by King Orifer. The army was also joined by all manners of birds and beasts. To stall their approach, Sauron committed one of his worst deeds. He burned the gardens of the Entwives south of Mirkwood, forever scarring that land as the Brownlands. But the last alliance pushed on, and were joined by the forces of Gondor led by Anarion. Then, on the plain of Dagorlad, they engaged Sauron's army. Orcs, Easterlings, Southrons, other birds and beasts, and even some evil dwarves. Perhaps most ironic is that Sauron was joined by many black Numenoreans, now serving the very creature that had led their old king to his destruction. The Battle of Dagorlad was perhaps one of the greatest battles in the history of Middle-earth, but it was not without losses. We know that the Sylvan Elves suffered enormously after King Orifer refused to put his forces under the command of King Gil-galad. Half the army of Lothlorien was lost, as was 2/3 of the army of Mirkwood, and both Orifer and Amdir perished. But the alliance was victorious, and managed to break into Mordor. Despite that, victory was not swift. Sauron had the supplies and manpower to sustain a siege in Barad-dûr for another 7 years, and during that siege, Anarion was killed by a stone thrown from the tower. However, Sauron eventually grew so desperate that he himself was forced to sally forth. This gamble almost paid off. The last alliance was driven back, and on the slopes of Mount Doom, another decisive battle was fought. There, Sauron encountered Elendil and Gil-galad, who were accompanied by Isildur, Elrond, and Círdan. In a legendary duel, Sauron burnt Gil-galad to death, and Elendil was killed too, Narsil breaking beneath him as he fell. But Sauron was so grievously wounded, and lived just long enough for Isildur to cut the One Ring from his finger. Then, Sauron too died once again, his spirit fleeing into the east, gone, but only temporary. In a moment that proved to be fateful, Isildur rejected the advice to destroy the One Ring, taking it as compensation for the deaths of his father and brother, although as later events proved, he would not have been able to do it anyway. Thus, the Third Age began, and the last alliance dissolved. Successful it had been, but the cost had been great. High King Gil-galad and High King Elendil were both dead, Anarion, one of the co-kings of Gondor, was also dead, as were the two kings of the Sylvan realms, Amdir and Oropher. In terms of known kings, Isildur was the sole survivor, and now he was High King of Arnor and Gondor. He returned to Gondor, where he met with Meneldil, the son of Anarion, and together they spent a year touring and organising the realm. Meanwhile, Arnor's battered army returned north through the Gap of Calenardon. They had taken high losses during the war, and this would not be without consequences. In the second year of the Third Age, it was finally time for Isildur to go north and take up the High Kingship in Numenas. With him, he had 200 of Arnor's best knights, as well as his 3 eldest sons, Elendur, Aratan, and Kirion. Meneldil was pleased to see him leave, and hoped that he would be long occupied in the north. The son of Anarion was described as a man of courtesy, but also of foresight. He seemed to have sensed that something bad might have happened if Isildur stuck around, or at the very least, he was keen to operate Gondor with a bit more independence. And to be fair to Meneldil, he wasn't wrong, for Isildur had one stop before he returned to Arnor, Rivendell. Officially, it was to pick up his wife and his youngest son, Valandil, who had been 4 years old when Isildur left to fight against Sauron, and was now still only 11. But there was another reason, and that was the One Ring. In the 2 years that Isildur had possessed the One Ring, he had come to the realization that it was beyond his power to use, and he seems to have come to the conclusion that it needed to go to the Keepers of the Three, Elrond, Círdan, or Galadriel. So Isildur did not follow his army through the Gap of Calenardon, and instead marched north up the Vales of Anduin with the intent on taking the High Pass into Rivendell. It would be a long journey, but on paper, it should have been safe. These lands were held by peoples friendly to the Numenoreans, and Sauron was defeated. But fatefully, Isildur was wrong. Over 10 years ago, before the last alliance had even set forth, Sauron had ordered soldiers into the Misty Mountains with the intent of ambushing the last alliance as they passed through. But the commander of these orcs got cold feet. The last alliance was far larger than they expected, so the ambush never happened. And even though Sauron was now gone, those troops still remained, although they did not know of Sauron's demise. They had watched as the battered remnants of Oriphar's army returned north, but they would not be so passive when it came to Isildur's 200-man company. As Isildur's company marched up the eastern side of the Anduin, adjacent to the marshlands known as the Gladden Fields, they were suddenly ambushed by orcs coming down the slope from Mirkwood. The first attack was disorganized, and the Numenoreans were able to defeat it with their superior weapons and stature. But shortly after resuming their journey, they were attacked again, and this time the orcs had adapted to the Numenorean tactics. Instead of trying to break the Numenorean shield wall conventionally, they surrounded it and simply threw themselves into it and on top of it, and when individual Numenorean soldiers collapsed due to the weight, they were dragged out by their feet and slain. Kirion was killed this way, and Aratan was mortally wounded in an attempt to save him. It was at this moment that Elendur pulled Isildur aside, and told him to take the One Ring and escape. Reluctantly, Isildur did so, abandoning his last remaining son and the surviving soldiers. They were all killed behind him. Despite the heavy current, he managed to swim across the Anduin, but in a fateful moment, the One Ring slipped from his finger as he made it to the other side. A party of orcs was nearby, and seeing what looked like a monster rising from the riverbank, they loosed arrows at it and fled. One arrow pierced his throat, one pierced his heart, and Isildur fell back silently into the water. The reign of the second High King had been all too brief indeed. In the end, there was only 3 survivors from the battle. One was Otar, who before the orcs attacked, he had been given these shards of Narsil and was ordered to bear them to safety no matter the cost. He was ordered to take a companion with him, and in the end they were successful. The third survivor was Estelmo, the esquire of Elendur, who had been stunned, and the body of Elendur had fallen atop him. Perhaps he would later have been killed when the orcs started mutilating the bodies, but the orcs were forced to flee shortly afterwards when a company of woodmen showed up on the scene. This battle was called the Disaster of the Gladden Fields, and a disaster it was. Arnor had already suffered grievously during the War of the Last Alliance, and now a further 200 soldiers had fallen. Considering they were the High King's bodyguards, you could safely assume that they were some of Arnor's best. There was the death of Isildur, a hero in many ways, who never had a chance to rule his new kingdom. There were deaths of his 3 eldest sons, Elendil, Cirion, and Arthedain. The death of Elendil was a true tragedy, as he was described as being remarkably similar to his legendary grandfather, Elendil. And then, of course, there was the loss of the One Ring. With all of these deaths, Valandil was now king, but not High King. You see, in the cases of both Elendil and Isildur, they were the High Kings because they were the most senior figure in the realms by far. They had the respect and gravitas. But Valandil was 13 years old, he couldn't even rule for himself yet, and his counterpart in Gondor, Meneldil, the son of Anarion, was an experienced man of 125, and even had a son of his own who was older than Valandil. So the boy king, who needed a regent, ruling from a weaker kingdom far away to the north, would not be High King of Gondor as well. No, Gondor would become truly independent, and the kingdoms would be split, and the gap between them would only grow. So what happened to Arnor next? Well, a lot of Arnor's earlier history is lacking. 10 years into the Third Age, Valandil would become king in his own right, but he ruled over a diminished kingdom. As I said earlier, Arnor's army had suffered huge losses during the war, far more than Gondor, and as a result, the men of Arnor immediately had to start abandoning some of the places that Elendil had built. This started a trend of depopulation. For example, the lands that would become the Shire, once important farmland, would gradually be abandoned, eventually becoming the king's hunting grounds. Another example was the capital of Numenor, the city of Elendil, built by the shores of Lake Evendim. It would decline in importance, and the city of Fornost would eventually take its place. Valandil would rule Arnor for 239 years, longer than any other king in both Arnor and Gondor. One has to feel for him. He never truly got to know his grandfather, his father, nor his elder brothers. Everything he knew about these heroes would have been second-hand. His reign was apparently peaceful and uneventful, and the same can be said for his next few direct descendants, Eldacar, Arantar, Tarkil, and Torondor. Notably, perhaps due to the fact that their kingdom was also weaker and slowly declining, the kings of Arnor did not live as long as their counterparts in Gondor. Torondor lived to be 230, but the king of Gondor at the same time, Turambar, lived to be 270. But then we arrive at King Valander. He is an interesting one because he dies relatively young, aged 190, after ruling for only 50 years. As I just mentioned before, Torondor, his father, lived to be 230 and ruled for 87 years. In the appendices, Valander also has a dagger symbol next to his name, indicating that he died violently. However, we're not told how he died or who was responsible. Possible theories are that he was killed in an earlier form of the internal strife that would later split the kingdom. He may have been killed putting down an uprising of middle men, possibly the hillmen of Rudour, or that Arnor may have fought a conflict with someone beyond its border at this time, possibly the men of Angmar. At the very least, Valander's early death might indicate that Arnor was not as peaceful during this time as we might think, which would help better explain the decline of the kingdom. Two more kings followed Valander, Elendil and Eärendil. Elendil's reign was seemingly uneventful, but Eärendil's was not. You see, we don't know much about Eärendil. We actually know more about his sons, despite the fact we only know the name of the eldest son, Amliath. While we don't know the exact truth of the matter, it seems that Eärendil's sons hated each other, and that factions were probably forming within the kingdom even during his reign. Perhaps Eärendil did everything he could to defuse the situation. Perhaps he was weak and simply watched. It doesn't matter, because upon his death in 861 of the Third Age, Arnor suffered its next great catastrophe. It split in 3. As I said, we don't know the exact reason for the split, whether it was for purely political reasons or for personal reasons, but what we do know is that the split wasn't amicable, because the kingdoms often went to war with each other, further weakening the Dunedain. That's what the descendants of the Numenoreans called themselves now. Before we get to that though, let's talk about our 3 new kingdoms, because they're the main characters in the next stage of the play: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudour. Arthedain, the realm of men, was the true successor, ruled by the eldest son and heir, Amliath Fornost, called that because he seems to have been the one who moved the capital to Fornost. Numenas was either abandoned at this time or shortly afterwards. Arthedain was the largest and strongest of the three realms. It retained most of the north and west of Arnor, from Thorokel in the north to the Brandywine in the south, from the River Lune in the west to the Weather Hills in the east. Rather importantly, Arthedain seems to have had the largest population of Dunedain spread out across the heartland of the kingdom between the North Downs and the hills of Evendim. Also, as later events would show, Arthedain retained great relations with the elves, those in Rivendell and in Lindon. The second kingdom was Cardolan, the Red Hill country. We don't know which brother ruled Cardolan. Cardolan was mostly based out of the region of Minhiriath, from the east-west road in the north to the Great Sea in the south, from the Brandywine in the west to the rivers Gwathlo and Mythithel in the east. We don't know what the capital was either. It was possibly Tharbad, the major town on the Gwathlo, but we also know that another important place to the Dunedain was Terran Gorthad, the Barrow Downs. While Cardolan also had many of the Dunedain, who mostly dwelt in the north of the kingdom, or probably in Tharbad, much of the region of Minhiriath was populated by middle men, probably of both Gwytherim and men of Eriador stock. The last kingdom was Rhudaur, the Eastern Forest. Once again, we don't know which brother ruled Rhudaur. The kingdom was mostly based out of the Troll Shores, from the Etten Moors in the north to the Bruinen in the south, from the Weather Hills in the west to the Misty Mountains in the east. Once again, we don't know where the capital was. You may have seen Camath Bryn, cool name, but a fanfiction place that doesn't exist in Tolkien's work. Rhudaur had the smallest population of Dunedain. In fact, they were a small minority and much of the kingdom's population were hillmen, their origins unknown, but they would come to play a major role in the history of Rhudaur, and in fact, all of Arnor. So we have our three kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. As I said earlier, we know that they warred with each other. We're not sure of the scale or how frequently, but it was enough to further weaken the Dunedain and all of Arnor. However, we do know what Cardolan and Rhudaur desired, and that was the Tower of Amansul, not just because of its strategic location at the southernmost point of the Weather Hills, but because it contained one of the Palantiri. Remember, Arthedain already had two, one in Numenas, although presumably now in Fornost, and the other in Elostirion, the Tower Hills. Rhudaur and Cardolan had none. Much like with Arnor's earliest history, we don't actually know a lot about what was going on during this time. Amliath ruled till 946, and then he was succeeded by his son, Beleg. You'll notice that from Amliath onwards, the kings of Arthedain stopped taking names in Quenya, and instead took names in Sindarin. Following Beleg was Malor. His reign is noteworthy for the fact that around 1050, hobbits, specifically the Harfoots, were first sighted in Eriador, mostly settling in Rhudaur but gradually moving westwards. During the reign of Celophan, Malor's successor, even more hobbits, the Fallowhides and the Stores, entered Eriador. The Fallowhides initially settled north of Rivendell before gradually moving west, while the Stores emerged further south in the angle of Rhudaur and in Dunland. Celophan was followed by Celebrimbor, and while neither Celebrimbor or his reign were notable, it needs to be said that after Celebrimbor, things were about to change, and not in a good way. You see, that's actually a good way to describe Arnorian history, and then it got worse. In 1272, King Celebrimbor of Arthedain died, and he was succeeded by Malvagil. 28 years into Malvagil's reign, a fourth kingdom entered the arena. In the cold, harsh land north of the Etten Moors, one of the few places in Eriador that the old Numenoreans never tried to settle, the leader of the Nazgul founded a new realm, Angmar, and he would become known as its Witch King. He drew to himself evil men, orcs from the mountains, and other fell creatures. He made his capital at the fortress of Khan Dum in the mountains of Angmar, and his power even crept across the Misty Mountains into the upper vales of Anduin. The hobbits were the first to notice the change. The climate in eastern Eriador, around Rhudaur, began to worsen during this time, growing colder, possibly thanks to the Witch King's magic. In response, many of the Harfoots and the Fallowhides migrated even further west, some beyond the Weather Hills to where the town of Bree was. In 1349, Malvagil died and his son took the throne. His son also took the name Argaleb. This is important, as the R was a royal prefix. The reason Argoleb did this was because he was claiming all of Arnor. He was claiming all of Arnor because by this time, the line of Isildur had died out in both Cardolan and Rhudaur. Thus, Argoleb believed that he could claim sovereignty over all of Arnor. When the other royal lines died out is unknown. Presumably, one of them was recent, probably during the reign of Malvagil, which was why Argoleb claimed all of Arnor when he did. Given the power struggles that were currently happening in Rhudaur, it's possible that it occurred there. So how did the other kingdoms react to Argoleb's claim? Well, in Cardolan they accepted it. This, along with later alliances that formed, seemed to suggest that relations between Arthedain and Cardolan had been on the up for a while. Cardolan remained a separate nation, but it seems to have taken up something of a vassal status beneath Arthedain, and it was no longer ruled by a king, and instead by a prince. But in the east, Rhudaur rejected this claim. By this point in time, things were grim in Rhudaur. The Dunedain were always a minority there, but now they were so weak that they weren't even in power anymore. In fact, the kingdom had been usurped by a leader of the Hillmen, and unknown to others at the time, this Lord of the Hillmen was in a secret alliance with Angmar. For his part, Argoleb recognized that war was inevitable and refortified the Weather Hills. This proved to be a smart move, as in 1356, the forces of Rhudaur and Angmar attacked, and Argoleb was killed in battle. It now became apparent that this was no mere petty civil war. Angmar was an existential threat, and the traitorous kingdom of Rhudaur had sided with it. Cardolan and the elves of Lindon rallied behind Arthedain, and the new king, Arveleg, was able to hold the Weather Hills and drive back the forces of Angmar and Rhudaur. Recognizing that the threat must be contained, Arthedain and Cardolan maintained a joint frontier that ran from the Weather Hills across the Great Road and to the lower section of the River Mithithil. Faced with a combined foe in the west, the Witch King waited for his power to grow, but in the meantime, he decided to deal with a threat behind enemy lines and besieged Rivendell. Remember earlier how I said that things in Arnor just kept getting worse? Well, yeah, it happens again. Arthedain and Cardolan hold their new frontier for 53 years, but in 1409 everything goes to hell, and Eriador sees devastation not seen since the War of the Elves and Sauron in the Second Age. While the North Downs and the Weather Hills provided a strong defensive barrier for Arthedain, Cardolan only had the protection of the River Mithithil. Sure, a river is a strong barrier, but the land beyond was flat and not easy to defend. And this is where the Witch King exploited. His forces crossed the river, and the invasion of Arnor was underway. The Witch King's first aim seems to have been to split his opponent's forces, and the best way to do this was to take the watchtower of Amon Sul at the southern point of the Weather Hills. It was a strategic location. Controlling it allowed one to control the Great Road, which was historically the border of Arthedain and Cardolan. Having entered Cardolan, the Witch King's forces were able to surround the tower without a costly assault of the Weather Hills. It was burnt to the ground, and King Arveleg was slain in its defense. The only bit of good news was that the Palantir, which had to be carried by several men, was saved and brought back to Fornost. With Arthedain in full retreat towards the North Downs, the Witch King's forces could focus on Cardolan. In Tolkien's words, the kingdom is ravaged. We have no idea how far south or west the Witch King's forces moved, but we do know that the remaining Dunedain of Cardolan retreated into the Barrow Downs and the Old Forest, effectively relinquishing the rest of their kingdom to the forces of Angmar. At some point during this time, the last prince of Cardolan is killed while fighting the men of Khand Dûm, a spear having pierced his heart. His body is carried back to the Barrow Downs, where he is buried. But the Witch King was not done. Cardolan's power was broken, but Arthedain still held Fornost and the North Downs. The new king was Arathor. He was merely 18 years old at the time, with no son of his own. If there was ever a time the line of Isildur could have been ended, then this was it. He had an enormous task before him, but he had the help of Círdan and the elves from Lindon. Arathor proved to be valiant and competent. Angmar's forces, perhaps running out of steam, were driven back. The Witch King had failed to destroy Arnor, but make no mistake, this was a major victory for Angmar. Arthedain's frontier along the Weather Hills had been broken, Amon Sul had been destroyed, King Arveleg had been killed, and Fornost was only saved by the valiant effort of the new king and the arrival of elves from Lindon. As for Cardolan, its lands were in ruin. It had been reduced to a rump state in the Old Forest and the Barrow Downs. In the south, Tharbad had survived, but far from the rest of Arnor, it seemed to be growing more independent. The Witch King also used his victories in Arnor as an opportunity to take full control of Rhudaur. The alliance was over, evil men that were subject to Angmar occupied the country, and any would-be resistors were killed or driven away. This included the last of the Dunedain of Rhudaur, who, even after 1356, perhaps thought that they could one day retake control of their kingdom from the Hillmen. This dream was over, and Rhudaur was now a lost land to the Dunedain. Those that survived fled west. From this point on, Rhudaur would become a dark land, with grim-looking castles and towers dominating the rugged terrain, occupied by men who were being taught dark sorceries from Angmar. It's possible that the Witch King would have kept up the pressure, and after a few more decades he would have attacked again and overrun Arthedain for good, but the Witch King made an error that would severely hamper his progress, the error being that he had pissed off the elves. Remember how he had been besieging Rivendell since around 1356? Well, in 1409 the siege is broken, and after Arthedain is saved, the elves counterattack. Not just with elves from Lindon and Rivendell, Elrond also summons help from across the Misty Mountains, and the elves of Lorien join in on the action. Our only description of the event is that Angmar is subdued for a time. The elves seem to have invaded, done enough damage so that Angmar was also left weak, but much like the Witch King with Arnor, they weren't quite able to finish Angmar off. So by the end of 1409, the board had been somewhat reset. What this means in reality is that a lot of people were now dead, and all actors that were involved in the war needed time to recover. Angmar needed to recover from the damage wrought by the elves, and it needed to secure its new iron grip over Rhudaur. Arthedain needed to stabilize and secure a new frontier against future invasions from Angmar. Cardolan, firstly, needed to survive, and secondly, hope for a miracle. And the elves, despite their declining strength, needed to remain ready, because their aid had been proven invaluable to the Dunedain, and they would doubtless be needed again in the future. Thus, the best way to describe it would be as a race to see who could recover first. Fortunately for young Arathor, the rest of his reign would be peaceful. Thanks to coming to the throne at such a young age, the reign would last 180 years, the longest of any of the northern line apart from Valandil. He died aged 198, and to bring your attention back to the decline of the northern Dunedain compared to the southern Dunedain in Gondor, Arathor's counterpart, Jarmendikill II, lived to be 230. Arathor was succeeded by Argaleb II, who came to the throne in 1589. The beginning of Argaleb II's reign was quite hopeful, and it would have appeared that it would be nothing like the short reign of his predecessor of the same name. I say it was hopeful because in 1601, the Hobbits undertake another mass migration. I spoke about them earlier. The Harfoots and the Fallowhides had originally settled in Rhudaur, but gradually moved westward until they reached Bree. In the south, the Stores had settled the Angle and in Dunland, but following the occupation of Rhudaur, many of them had fled back across the Misty Mountains, the ancestors of Smeagol. However, many would also remain behind. One way or another, the Hobbits had survived the invasion of 1409, and now, led by Marco and Blanco, many of them now migrated into the land that would become known as the Shire. As I said earlier, the Shire had once been bountiful farmlands, but grew deserted during Arnor's decline, eventually becoming nothing more than the king's hunting grounds. Clearly eager to have new settlers in the heartland of Arthedain, Argaleb II granted the Hobbits permission to settle in these lands. Their only requirement was that they acknowledge the lordship of the King of Arnor, that they maintain the road and bridges, and grant aid to any royal messengers that enter the land. In 1630, the Fallowhides and Harfoots that had settled in the Shire were now joined by many of the Stores coming up from Dunland, and from that point onwards, most Hobbits in Middle-earth could now be found in the Shire. It's said that when the Hobbits settled in the Shire, there were still lots of men around at this time. The over 200 years of peace had allowed Arnor to recover, and the migration of the Hobbits further reinvigorated the kingdom. While perhaps not the most fit for military duty, future events would prove the Hobbits to be valiant fighters nonetheless, and their presence in the heartland of Arthedain stopped the general decay and abandonment of the region. Unfortunately, 200 years of recovery was about to be rendered almost worthless. And that was thanks to the Great Plague. In late 1635, the Great Plague appeared in Rhovanion and devastated the land. By 1636, it had arrived in Gondor, killing King Telemnar and emptying Osgiliath of its population. However, it was not done there. It passed through Calenardon, killing many as it went, and then passed into Eriador. While the Dunlendings were able to escape most of the damage thanks to their isolation, Tharbad was still a major town at this point. As far as we know, it even still had a Gondorian garrison there. It would have been the entry point for the Great Plague into the rest of Arnor. So the Great Plague passed up the road through Minhiriath, lands that nominally still belonged to Cardolan. These lands were absolutely devastated. We're told that most of the men there died, and even over 1,000 years later, few people lived in Minhiriath. But if that wasn't enough to destroy poor old Cardolan, then the Great Plague struck one last fatal blow. Those remaining Dunedain of Cardolan, who still dwelt in the Old Forest or the Barrow Downs, were finished off. There would be no miraculous survival, no recovery. This was the end of Cardolan, and now Arthedain stood alone. Speaking of Arthedain, unlike the rest of Eriador, whether through some quarantine methods or through the natural weakening of the plague, the northern parts of Arthedain, including Fornost, were mostly spared from the plague. But not all of Arthedain was so lucky. The Hobbits, who had been inhabiting their new lands for barely 30 years, suffered heavily from the Great Plague. But fortunately, they were the last, and by 1637, it had disappeared. But it could be argued that the damage of the Great Plague was where Arnor reached the point of no return. Sure, while Arthedain mostly escaped, their new subjects in the Hobbits did not, and more importantly, any chance of a revival of Cardolan was now gone. The Dunedain in the Barrow Downs were now dead, as were most of those middlemen who still resided in Minhiriath. The lands south of the Great Road were now mostly deserted, with the exception of Tharbad, but now that Gondor's garrison had also withdrawn and Cardolan was no more, this important town was now effectively independent. Arnor now truly only consisted of Arthedain. There was no more united front, there was only Fornost versus Khand Dûm. To make matters worse, the Witch King took advantage of the Great Plague. No, not through military operations, although to be fair, Angmar probably wasn't affected by the plague. No, instead, the Witch King used dark sorcery, and dark spirits out of Angmar and Rhudaur were sent into the Barrow Downs. There, they inhabited the old bones that were buried there, becoming known as the Barrow Wights, and it became a place of fear and terror. This would pay dividends for the Witch King in the future, but for now, it was an insult to the Dunedain, and really to all the men of Arnor. The Barrow Downs had been used as a burial site for all sorts of men since the First Age, and during the Third Age, the burial site for noble families such as the kings and princes of Cardolan. It was, well, without a doubt, sacrilege. Argleb II's eventful reign would end in 1670. He had inherited a recovering land, and he left behind one that was half in ruins, through absolutely no fault of his own, I might add. He would be succeeded by Arvagil, who ruled until 1743, and then Arvagil would be succeeded by Arveleg II, who ruled until 1813. I know I've spoken about it a few times, but perhaps to even further represent the decay of their land, the lifespans of the kings of Arthedain started declining even faster. Whereas Argleb II had lived to be 197, Arvagil had died at 190, and Arveleg II had only lived to be 180. But following Arveleg II, lifespans were the least of the Dunedain's worries, because after around 400 years of silence, Angmar was back. Arthedain was now ruled by King Araval. We don't know much about his early reign, but one very notable event happened in the second half of his reign, in the year 1851. Interestingly, you actually can't find information about this event in the appendices. You can only find it in the history of Middle-earth, but it fits neatly into the timeline, so there's no real reason to regard it as non-canon. So in 1851, there is a battle between the forces of Angmar and Arthedain, who were joined by the Elves of Lindon and the Elves of Rivendell. We don't know where this battle took place or how it was fought, but we know that Arnor and its allies were victorious. It must have been a fairly hope-inspiring win too, because it's clear that Araval wanted to keep the momentum going. Perhaps not having the strength to actually invade Angmar, he decided that he wished to reclaim Cardolan. Unfortunately, this is where the Witch King's Barrow Wights did their work. and any settlers sent into Cardaland were driven away. Arthedain had won a victory, but could do nothing further with it. And, as it turned out, this victory wasn't exactly decisive, and the future still looked bleak. 13 years after Araval's victory, his son, Arafant, had a son of his own. This boy was given the name Arvedui, which means last king in Sindarin, thanks to a prophecy by a man named Malbeth the Seer. Arvedui you shall call him, for he will be the last in Arthedain, though a choice will come to the Dunedain, and if they take the one that seems less hopeful, then your son will change his name and become king of a great realm. If not, then much sorrow and many lives of men shall pass, until the Dunedain arise and are united again. If Malbeth's prophecy could be trusted, then it was clear that the time of doom was approaching, and whether for good or ill, things would change after Arvedui. Fortunately for Araval, his victory ensured peace for the rest of his reign, and he died in 1891. But Arafant would not have the luxury of peace. During his reign, the attacks from Angmar once again ensued. The Witch King, realizing that he had the Dunedain with their backs against the wall, he did not need to force a decisive battle yet, and instead could simply win slowly through attrition. Although Arafant managed to hold back these attacks, he did so with dwindling strength. But late in Arafant's reign, there was a glimmer of hope. After many years of silence, Arnor and Gondor came into contact once again in the year 1940. Both kingdoms realised that there was a single force directing efforts to destroy them, and that they should aid each other in the fight against this evil. But while Gondor was still powerful, especially compared to Arthedain, they faced an existential threat at this time in the form of the Wainrider Easterlings. They could not send aid to Arthedain, but Arvedui was able to marry Firiel, the daughter of King Onderher. Just as a quick side note, there is an error in Tolkien's timeline here. Firiel was said to have married Arvedui in 1940, but Arvedui's son Aranarth was born in 1938. Aranarth was not an illegitimate child, so there's no real explanation as to how he was born before Arvedui and Firiel apparently wed. Basically, either Aranarth was born a few years later, or the alliance was formed a few years earlier, but this was never corrected by Tolkien. Moving on, so like I said, there was a glimmer of hope here. Gondor had promised aid, but it could not do so yet. All Arthedain had to do was hold out until the aid could be given. But in 1944, there was a complication. King Onderher and his two sons died at the disaster of the Morannon, putting Gondor in something of a succession crisis. Arvedui, seeing an opportunity, put forth his claim to the throne of Gondor, his argument that he was a descendant of Isildur, who was a king of Gondor, and that he was married to Firiel, Onderher's only surviving child, a descendant of Anarion. This is the part of Malbeth's prophecy where the Dunedain had a choice. If they took the one less hopeful, Arvedui would change his name and become the king of a great realm. Unfortunately for Arvedui, the Dunedain of Gondor did not take the less hopeful option, arguing that the rule of Gondor belonged solely to the heirs of Meneldil. Arvedui put forth some further arguments, but they were ignored, and in the end, the Dunedain of Gondor chose to crown Eärnil II, the victorious general, a descendant of Anarion, who had defeated the Wainriders. In the north, Arvedui had neither the strength nor the will to oppose the Gondorian choice, but his descendants never forgot that claim. That being said, Eärnil responded graciously to Arvedui, but I do not forget the royalty of Arnor, nor deny our kinship, nor wish that the realms of Elendil should be estranged. I will send to your aid when you have need, so far as I am able. But having just finished a devastating war, there would be time before Eärnil felt that Gondor was secure, and in that time, Angmar continued to mount pressure upon Arthedain. In 1964, Arafant died, and it became increasingly clear that the second part of Malbeth's prophecy was coming true. Upon the ascension of Arvedui, Malbeth made yet another prophecy, predicting that the future heir of Isildur, Aragorn, would walk the paths of the dead and awaken the Oathbreakers to fight against the Shadow. This was probably of small comfort to Arvedui. The attacks from Angmar continued, and finally, the time of doom arrived. In the autumn of 1973, Arvedui became aware of Angmar's preparations for a final hammer blow against Arthedain, and sent messages to King Eärnil II in Gondor. Eärnil responded right away, organising an army and fleet, and sending them north under the command of his son, Eärnur. Unfortunately, it was too late. In early 1974, during the middle of winter, the Witch King launched his final assault upon Arthedain. Fornost was captured, and the sons of Arvedui, Aranarth, and at least one unnamed other, along with the remnants of the Dunedain, were driven westwards across the River Lune into Lindon. Arvedui was not going to give up that easily. Although he had lost Fornost, he attempted to hold the North Downs, only fleeing when he had no other options, and only escaping with a few of his guards by the swiftness of their horses. Unable to flee to the west, they instead fled north, eventually ending up at the most northern point of the Blue Mountains, where they sought shelter in some old abandoned dwarf mines. They could only hide there for so long, and hunger forced them to ask for the aid of the local men, the Lossoth of Forakel. They were a strange, unfriendly people, experts at living in the icy lands of the north. They were not servants of the Witch King whom they feared, but they were neither too willing to help Arvedui and his men, as their jewels and riches had little value to them. Yet, out of pity and out of fear of their weapons, the Lossoth did yield and built shelters for the Dunedain and gave them some food. But Arvedui's horses had perished, so he could do little except wait out the winter and hope for help from the south. Somehow, Arvedui's flight north had become known to Aranarth, and he requested Círdan to evacuate his father. Círdan sent a ship, and by the time it arrived in March, conditions were still treacherous. The Lossoth warned Arvedui not to go aboard, telling him to wait until the summer when the power of the Witch King was lessened. Arvedui did not listen. He gave the Lossoth the Ring of Barahir, telling them its worth was beyond their reckoning, and that his kinsmen would later ransom it, for whatever they desired. Fatefully, he then boarded the ship, taking with him the Palantiri of Anuminas and Amonsul. As it turned out, the Lossoth were right. The strong winds blew the ship into the ice, where it became so stuck that even the expert mariners of Círdan were helpless. Overnight, the hull was crushed, the ship sank, and thus perished Arvedui into the icy waters. The last king indeed. Not long afterwards, the Might of Gondor arrived, a fleet so large that it couldn't even fit into the ports of Mithlond, Harlond, and Forlond. With it came an army that was equipped for a war of great kings, and the peoples of the north were amazed at such power, even if it was merely a part of Gondor's strength. With the Gondorians came some of the esteemed Northman cavalry, led by the proud princes of Ravanion, tall and fair. These horsemen had been invaluable during Gondor's wars in the south, and now they were about to show off their skills to Angmar. With the Gondorians having finally arrived, Círdan saw little reason to delay. He summoned forth any who would come to help, from both Lindon and Arnor, and they crossed the River Lune. Even a company of hobbits joined the army. They had actually sent defenders to Fornost originally, and although none had returned, and although the Shire was overrun during the war, it survived whereas many other places hadn't. The Witch King awaited them in Fornost. He had taken up his residence there, and had filled it with evil folk of Angmar. Yet in his pride, the Witch King made a mistake. He did not try to defend Fornost, and instead marched his army forth, planning on meeting his enemies in the field and sweeping them across the Lune, just as he had done to the Arnorians before. But he was not facing a weakening, helpless Arthedain. He was facing the might of Gondor with their Northmen auxiliaries. He was facing the remnants of Arnor that were driven by revenge, and he was facing the elves of Lindon, more skilled and experienced than anything he could put forth himself. The host of the west issued forth from the hills of Evendim, and it was not long before the Witch King's army was being driven back. If the Witch King hoped to salvage the situation, those hopes were shattered by the grand strategy of his enemies. Their cavalry had not joined the battle immediately, and circling around the hills of Evendim, they finally came down from the north. Angmar's army was shattered in a great rout, and the Witch King, gathering all that he could, abandoned Fornost and fled north to seek the safety of Angmar. But before he could reach Carndum, he was overtaken by the cavalry of Gondor led by Prince Eärnur, and also by the forces of Rivendell led by Glorfindel. This time, Angmar was destroyed, so thoroughly that not a man or orc of that realm remained west of the Misty Mountains. To say this was a bittersweet victory would be an understatement. Sure, Angmar had been completely destroyed, sure the Witch King had been driven away, not to return for over 1,000 years, but Arthedain, Arnor, had not truly survived either. Its heartland of Fornost and the North Downs had been taken, most of the kingdom overrun, most of the Dunedain destroyed. When the host of Gondor returned home, Arnor, the son of King Arvedui, was left looking upon a ruined land. He could claim the title of king, as was his birthright, but he would be king of ashes. At a minimum, it would take centuries for Arnor to recover, and during that time, they would be sitting ducks should evil return to the north. So he adopted a new way. He would not become king, but he would adopt the title of Chieftain of the Dunedain. The Dunedain would take on a new role, not as the kings and nobility of a mighty kingdom, but as silent protectors in the wilderness, so that those people that survived, such as the Hobbits of the Shire or the Men of Bree, could live their lives in peace and prosperity. Arnor officially no longer existed as a kingdom, but through the surviving Dunedain, Arnor could live on until one day it could return. But it would be wrong to end the story here. Just because Arnor was officially gone, it doesn't mean the history of those people that lived in Arnor suddenly vanished. Yes, lots of people had died during Angmar's invasion, but in some places, civilization continued. One of these places was the Shire. Once loyal subjects of the king, they now no longer had a king. So in the king's place, they created the title of Thane, given first to a hobbit named Bucca of the Marish. It was a military title, but as the years passed, and the Shire was mostly at peace, it became an honorary title. Another survivor of the war was Breeland. This was the town of Bree and the villages of Stattle, Archet, and Coombe. The men of Bree were survivors. They had been around since the First Age, had been subjects of Arnor, and had now survived it. It would now become an important trading post and bastion of civilization, where you could find men of different kinds, dwarves, hobbits, and although it's not said that elves ever went to Bree, the men of Bree did sometimes have dealings with them. Further to the south was a lesser known survivor of Arnor, and that was the town of Tharbad. Once an extremely important town owing to its position on the border of both Arnor and Gondor, the town had declined in importance as both kingdoms withdrew and the surrounding lands became emptier. That said, it also seems to have escaped the brunt of the war against Angmar. Small comfort though, as Tharbad was a town that was built thanks to Numenorean ingenuity. The marshlands had been drained, the rivers dredged, and the bridges and causeway required maintenance. But the men who dwelt in Tharbad now were not descendants of Numenor, being instead of those few men who had survived the lands of Enedwaith and Minhiriath. They had neither the knowledge or skill to maintain the land and keep back the encroachment of nature. You could argue that none of these people would have survived for long if not for the efforts of the remaining Dunedain. Under Arnor, the Dunedain became known as the Rangers of the North, a secretive people who roamed the wilderness, yet made great efforts in keeping the lands of Eriador safe. Tolkien indicated that they mostly dwelt in the Angle, a narrow strip of land between the rivers Bruinen and Mythythel, but they were known to spend time in Bree, where the locals didn't exactly take kindly to them. They also visited the ruins of Fornost, which became known as Dead Man's Dyke, and they had a guard post at Sarn Ford on the southern border of the Shire. Arnor also started a new tradition, the fostering of the sons of the chieftain or the future chieftain in Rivendell. This was to keep them safe until they could reach adulthood, and to provide them with the best possible teachers when it came to lore or survival. But it wasn't just the sons that were kept safely in Rivendell, so were the heirlooms of Arnor, the Sceptre of Numenas, the Shards of Narsil, the Elendelmere, and the Ring of Barahir, which seems to have been ransomed from the Lossoth not long after Arvedui's death. Fortunately for the new Rangers of the North, they weren't quite put to the test just yet. In 2063, the Watchful Peace began after the Necromancer, Sauron, fled from his fortress at Dol Guldur. Thanks to this, Eriador and most of the Westlands would be safe from organised assaults over the next few centuries, but that being said, dangers still remained in Eriador. Barrow-wights, wolves, and there were still trolls and orcs who dwelt in the Misty Mountains and the Etten Moors. We're told that the Dunedain continued to dwindle even despite these relatively peaceful times, indicating that being a ranger was never exactly a safe job. Arnor died in 2106, aged 168. His son, Arahael, succeeded him and continued the new traditions that his father had started. Arahael died in 2177 and was succeeded by Aranwyr. Aranwyr died in 2247 and was succeeded by Aravir. The reason why I'm rocketing through these chieftains is because we know nothing about them, and nothing notable happened during their reigns thanks to the Watchful Peace. However, when Aravir died in 2319, he was succeeded by Aragorn. No, not that Aragorn, Aragorn the First. Aragorn's reign lasted a brief 8 years. In 2327, he was killed by wolves, demonstrating that not even the chieftains were safe from the perils of the wilderness. Araglas then became chieftain, aged only 31, but his long reign would be peaceful and he would die in 2455, aged 159. One notable event during his reign is that the hobbits of the Shire would expand, settling the area of Buckland just beyond the river Brandywine. Things would be less peaceful for Araglas's son, Arahad. The Watchful Peace ended only 5 years into his rule. Middle-earth would once again burst into activity, especially in the south. But the northern lands felt it as well. Orcs in the Misty Mountains once again made their presence felt, and Celebrian, the wife of Elrond, was, for example, waylaid and captured while crossing the Misty Mountains in 2509, although she would soon be rescued by her sons. That said, the focus of evil was mostly on Gondor and the just newly created Rohan, so we're not told of any great events affecting Arahad, who died in 2523. The same would go for his next few descendants, Aragost, who died in 2588, Aravorn, who died in 2654, and Arahad II, who died in 2719. Notably, the lifespans of the chieftains seem to have stabilized around this point, as the 4 chieftains I just mentioned died aged 158, 157, 157, and 156 respectively. In comparison, the Dunedain of Gondor had started waning faster. The last known man to live longer than 150 was Steward Hador, who had died back in 2395. It was under the next chieftain, Arasweel, when the Dunedain of the North would face their biggest test since Angmar. After growing in strength throughout the previous 200 years, orcs suddenly erupted from the Misty Mountains and the Eton Moors and invaded Eriador in force in 2740. The Dunedain spent the next several years battling the orcs, performing admirably, but no doubt taking losses. Eventually, a band of orcs managed to break through in 2747, led by a warlord named Gulfimble. They invaded the Shire, but they got much more than they bargained for. They were met by a force of hobbits, led by the legendary Bandabras Took, who was tall enough to ride a horse. During the battle, he is alleged to have charged Gulfimble and knocked his head off with a club. The head landed in a rabbit hole 100 yards away, which is apparently how the game of golf was invented. At the death of their leader, the orcs fled, and that was as far as their invasion got, and it soon fizzled out, coming to an end the following year in 2748. But this was not the only trial of the reign of Arasweel. Only 10 years later, the Long Winter began. Although Rohan suffered the most punishment during this time, being conquered briefly by the Dunlendings and the Easterlings, it was still a dire time in Eriador. It's said that it snowed for almost 6 months, and this was especially tough for the hobbits. Many of them would die of starvation, despite the relief efforts of Gandalf and the Rangers. These were the toughest days the land of Eriador had experienced since the fall of Arthedain almost 800 years earlier. Arasweel died in 2784, peacefully, despite the difficulty of his reign. He was succeeded by his son, Arathorn. Not the father of Aragorn, this one is Arathorn the First. Arathorn the First is a bit of a mystery. His reign seems to have been, and should have been, peaceful. The orcs had been defeated during the reign of his father, and shortly after the beginning of his own reign, the orcs were almost wiped out in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. But rather interestingly, Tolkien has Arathorn the First listed down as dying violently in 2884, when he was aged 155. Given his father pretty much died at the same age due to old age, it makes you wonder what Arathorn was doing that allowed him to get killed. I guess, rather concerningly, it could have meant that Arathorn's house was attacked and that he was killed there. Arathorn I was succeeded by Argnui. The early years of his reign seems to have been uneventful, but the truth of the matter was that darkness was growing in Middle-earth, and that was plain for everyone to see. However, the final 2 years of his reign saw devastation once again return to Eriador. In 2911, the Fell Winter began. Although not as long or as deadly as the Long Winter, it was still a time of hardship, especially for the Shire, which was invaded by packs of white wolves. but more devastation followed after the winter was over. The snow melted, which caused great floods in Enedwaith. The Great Bridge at Tharbad was broken, and after over 1,000 years of decay, the town, one of the last remnants of old Arnor, was finally abandoned. Argonui would die that same year, and the reins of leadership would pass to his son, Arador. Interestingly, Arador lived in a house north of the Troll Shores, near to the source of the River Methythel. This was an interesting place to live, given that the northern Troll Shores were more associated with the dangers of the Ettenmoors, such as orcs and trolls. Nonetheless, Arador's early reign seems to have been uneventful, but we have more details towards the end of his reign, largely in relation to his son and his eventual grandson. Arador's son was Arathorn. He sought the hand of a woman named Gilrain. Gilrain was the daughter of Dirhael, who was descended from Aranarth, and of Ivorwen. Now, Dirhael did not approve of this marriage, partly because Gilrain was too young in the eyes of the Dunedain. She was 22, whereas Arathorn was 56. Sounds bad, but you have to remember that Arathorn was still pretty young for one of the House of Isildur. But that's not the only reason. Dirhael had the gift of foresight, and he'd seen some bad things. He predicted that Arathorn would become chieftain soon, which did not bode well for Arador, who was 109 at that time and should have had plenty more years left to live. But he also predicted that Arathorn himself would not live very long. Basically, this was going to be a very eventful, yet unhappy marriage for Gilrain. But this is when Ivorwen stepped in. She also had the gift of foresight, and for that reason, she had seen that Gilrain and Arathorn needed to wed, and needed to do so soon, because from them, hope could be born. If they delayed, there would be no hope for the rest of the age. Yes, if you've seen the fan film Born of Hope, that's where the name comes from. And yeah, you should probably know what's going to happen next. Dirhael relented, and Arathorn and Gilrain were wed. But Dirhael's visions came true. In 2930, the following year, Arador was captured by hill trolls and killed, and Arathorn became chieftain as Arathorn II. He had a son with Gilrain in 2931, but then, merely 2 years later, he went hunting orcs with the sons of Elrond. He did not return alive, as during the hunt, he was shot in the eye by an arrow. In the space of 3 years, 2 chieftains were dead, and Isildur's heir was now a 2-year-old child. But that 2-year-old child was none other than Aragorn. Aragorn II. I could realistically do an entire podcast about Aragorn's life. There's so much that goes on, so much of his journey that happens before the Lord of the Rings. When we do meet him in the Lord of the Rings, he has been preparing for almost 70 years to become the King of Arnor and Gondor. To briefly summarise, Gilrain takes Aragorn to Rivendell where he is fostered, his true identity concealed from him until he reaches the age of 20. During his childhood, he is called Estel, meaning hope. Shortly afterwards, he meets Gandalf and befriends him. From 2957, Aragorn takes the name Thorongil, and spends many years journeying around the Westlands. Notably, he enters the service of King Thengel of Rohan for a time, and later he enters the service of Steward Ecthelion II of Gondor. He was extremely popular in Gondor, much to the annoyance of a young Denethor who had guessed his identity, and his greatest achievement came when he led a daring raid on Umbar in 2980, burning the Corsair fleet at Ankar and slaying the captain of the harbour. But he did not return to Gondor, instead spending time exploring the south and east of Middle-earth, before eventually returning to Lothlorien later that year. It was shortly afterwards where he would receive his greatest challenge yet. He had sought the hand of Arwen Undomiel in marriage, Elrond's daughter, but Elrond told him that it was still beyond him and to wait. Now, many years later, Elrond gave forth his terms. Arwen would only be allowed to marry Aragorn if he became both kings of Arnor and Gondor. So Aragorn waited as the shadow lengthened, spending most of his time in the northern lands, taking part in the multi-year long task that was the hunt for Gollum. He eventually succeeded, and returned to Eriador where he met Gandalf, and learned of Frodo Baggins. As you probably know, Frodo Baggins possessed the One Ring. This had become known to Sauron through the capturing of Gollum, but Sauron did not know where the Shire was, nor did the Nazgul know either. Yes, it's odd that the Witch King didn't know. They spent months fruitlessly searching until they were sent to Isengard. Saruman, who had no interest in allowing Sauron to have the One Ring for himself, promptly misdirected the Nazgul, but they came across Wormtongue, who gave them the correct directions. The Nazgul passed into Eriador and started riding towards the Shire. But they faced one obstacle: the Rangers of the North, who guarded Sarn Ford. Their guard had been doubled only a few years earlier. They had faced wolves, trolls, orcs, but Nazgul were many levels above, and they did not have Aragorn with them. To their credit, they managed to hold the ford during the day, but at night the Nazgul swept over them. Some were killed in the defense, and the rest scattered. But some of the Nazgul, including the Witch King, kept pursuing them to keep them from regrouping. Meanwhile, the other Nazgul, led by Khamul the Easterling, entered the Shire. This brings us to the events of the Lord of the Rings, where Aragorn helps lead the hobbits to Rivendell, and then plays an integral role in the Fellowship, becoming its leader after the fall of Gandalf and Moria. He serves in Rohan during the first stage of the War of the Ring, taking part in the Battle of the Hornburg and witnessing the parley with Saruman. Upon leaving Isengard, he comes across some old friends, the Sons of Elrond, Elladan and Elrohir, and 30 Rangers of the North, led by his kinsman, Halbarad. This is the group known as the Grey Company, and it was Arnor's contribution to the War of the Ring. The Grey Company probably isn't indicative of how many Rangers were left in the north. Halbarad had very little time to gather them, so it was probably just those who were either in or near to Rivendell when the summons were received. Not only that, we know the Misty Mountains were full of activity during this time, and it's probable that some orcs raided in Eriador. However, we also know that the Rangers were away from the Shire, where Saruman's agents infiltrated and then took over. First, Lotho Sackville Baggins was in charge, but he was just a figurehead, and he was imprisoned and then killed when Saruman arrived under the alias of Sharky many months later. Back in Rohan, the time had come for Aragorn to fulfill the ancient prophecy that was spoken by Malbeth the Seer many years ago, enter the paths of the dead and hold the Oathbreakers to their ancient oath. This Aragorn did, and then he would ride through Gondor, driving the Corsairs and Haradrim before him. He would commandeer the Corsair fleet at Pelagir, and then sail it north to Harlond, just south of Minas Tirith. At a pivotal moment at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Aragorn unfurled the standard of Elendil, sewn by Arwen, the white tree with 7 stars and a crown above it. With the arrival of Aragorn's reinforcements, the battle was won. Although he was back in Gondor and now his status was legendary, Aragorn did not claim the crown yet. He would only do that once Sauron was defeated. Nevertheless, he led the host of the West on what seemed like their suicidal attack on Mordor, but this was a distraction to allow Frodo to reach Mount Doom. The plan worked. Gollum fell into the fire clasping the One Ring, and Sauron was destroyed, this time for good. Although Aragorn did not strike the killing blow, he played a major role in finishing the work of Elendil and Isildur over 3,000 years earlier. Upon his return to Gondor, Aragorn was crowned, not as just King of Gondor or Arnor, but as King of the reunited kingdom. Later that year, he married Arwen, and from Elrond he received the Scepter of Annúminas, signifying his kingship over Arnor. But he did not return north with his friends right away. The hobbits and Gandalf made their way north with many others, and at Bree, Gandalf told the innkeeper at the Prancing Pony, Barlaam Mojtaba, that the king had come again. But there was one last part of former Arnor where the war had not yet ended. That was the Shire, where Saruman and his ruffians had taken over, a last-ditch, pathetic attempt by him to claim some dominion over Middle-earth. Thanks to the courage of the returning hobbits and the leadership skills of Merry and Pippin, the hobbits rose up against their oppressors, and at the Battle of Bywater, Saruman's troops were decisively defeated. Saruman was killed shortly afterwards, murdered by his own servant Wormtongue, and the War of the Ring was over. So, what happened to Arnor after the war and in the Fourth Age? Well, even though it was a time of hope and the king had come again, it didn't change the fact that Arnor was still mostly a depopulated wilderness. It would take many years, probably beyond the reign of Aragorn, now King Elessar, before civilization started properly bouncing back. What we do know is that Elessar took up residence at Annúminas from time to time, indicating that he was probably rebuilding Elendil's old city. Gandalf also told Barlaam Mojtaba that the king would also rebuild Fornos Dorain. Hard to argue with Gandalf, so we can assume that that happened too. Given Tharbad's extremely important location, it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that it was also rebuilt and the Great Bridge repaired. Iñesta also reorganised the borders, specifically in regards to the Hobbits. He made the Shire an independent land under the protection of the reunited kingdom. He forbade men from entering, a rule that even he followed, and whenever he was there to meet his friends, he met them at the bridge over the Brandywine. He also extended the Shire's borders westwards, giving them the White Downs and everything up to the Tower Hills. And finally, he allowed the Shire to have 3 special councillors to the Northern Realm, the Thane, the Master of Buckland, and the Mayor of Mickle Delving. Aragorn II started his life as the youngest chieftain of the Dunedain. The line of Isildur had avoided destruction by a mere 2 years, and his people had dwindled even from the days of Arnor, the first chieftain. When he died in 120 of the Fourth Age, it was as King Iñesta of the reunited kingdom, which included most of the lands of his ancestral homeland of Arnor, and of course, all of Gondor. He died aged 210, yet had lived all of his ancestors up to King Celebrimbor of Arthedain, who had died almost 2,000 years later. After that, his son, Eldarion, took up the throne, the future of the reunited kingdom, and Arnor looked bright, as it was said that Eldarion would be the king of a great realm, and after him it would endure for 100 generations of men, and from him should come the kings of many realms in the long days after, until the world was changed. Thank you for watching and listening and perhaps sleeping to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. Doing these is an absolute mammoth project, but I get to do one of my favourite hobbies, writing, and I get to talk about one of my favourite parts of the Legendarium, Arnor. If there was more information, I would gladly have it, even if it meant this video was an extra 3 hours longer. But alas, this is really as much as there is. It might be a while before the next one of these, but if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I really need a glass of water right now.